Hey, everybody. This is Wonderland Book Club with Kathryn Schwille of What Luck This Life. And we are excited to have Kathryn with us for our first meeting of 2021. And Kathryn has been waiting for this for 2 years. Her book came out in 2018, but it is still extremely fresh. We just memorialized or recognized or marked the 35th anniversary of the Challenger explosion on January 28, 1986, and on February 1st this year will be the 18th anniversary of the Columbia explosion, which occurred February 1st, 2003, which was a Saturday, and I'm sure a lot of you in the room do remember that. I do remember that my son was just a little babe in the arms right there. But if 18 years, you'd be a teenager right now if you were born that on that day. It's a long time ago, but it's still fresh in our memories. And we're really excited to have Kathryn Schwille here to talk about her book, and for you to talk about her book with Wonderland Book Club. Wonderland Book Club is co-sponsored by the North Carolina Writers Network, and we appreciate their sponsorship and support, and having many of you in this room are also North Carolina Writers Network members, which serves to bring writers together from all over the state and beyond. We have many members also from beyond the borders of North Carolina. We also are co-sponsored by Quail Ridge Books, which is in the heart of Raleigh and Midtown, and they give us great discounts on our books, and we are part of their book club. Well, on with the program. So Kathryn Schwille is the author of What Luck This Life, selected by the Atlantic Journal-Constitution as one of the best Southern books of 2018. Her short stories have appeared in New Letters, Memorious, Crazy Horse, Literary Hub, and many other journals, and she has been twice cited for special mention in the Pushcart Prize. In 2013, she received an Individual Artist Fellowship from the North Carolina Arts Council. She's a former editor at the Charlotte Observer, graduate of the MFA program at Warren Wilson College, and has received fellowships from the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts and the Hambridge Center for the Arts and Sciences. Described by Booklist as a deeply thought-provoking novel, What Luck This Life was awarded a bronze medal in literary fiction from the Independent Book Publishers. And the Atlantic Journal-Constitution reviewer wrote, "Each word of this slim novel is impactful. Despite the character's grim undertaking, the world Schwille envisions is one no reader will ever want to leave." Kathryn lives in Charlotte, where she is an editor and mentor to writers and teachers at the Charlotte Center for Literary Arts. And this spring, I don't know if this is still happening, but she is the visiting writer at Gardner-Webb University, which is right outside Charlotte. And I give you all Kathryn Schwille, and please go ahead and mute yourselves, and you can unmute yourself when you have a question. We're a really small casual group, so just go ahead and or you can also put questions in the chat. Kathryn, please take it away, and we're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Alice. I'm grateful to this book club, which I consider to be the most famous book club in North Carolina.
Aww.
And thanks also to the North Carolina Writers Network and Quail Ridge Books. Quail Ridge was the first bookstore to put my book in their cover, in their window, and it was the first time I ever saw my book on display, and I remember the moment vividly. So I love those folks. I thought I'd start out by talking a little bit about how this book came to be, and some about my research, and then I'll talk some about how, since many of you are writers, about the form that this book took and how that happened also. I was reading my Saturday paper one day in 2005, and you may remember when your local paper had stories from all over in it, and it was a nice fat paper even on Saturday morning. And I came across this story from New Orleans, and it was from a forensics conference. And there was a woman, the reporter had gone to this session in this conference, and the woman was talking about, she was from Israel. She was talking about her current project, which was she had been handed the diary from the astronaut Elon Ramon, who had died on the space shuttle on the Columbia. And 2 months after the Columbia came down, his diary, or parts of his diary, had been found in the woods in East Texas. It was her job to take the diary apart. It was all wadded up and it was all squished together by the rain and the sun and the wind. She was taking it apart in hopes that there would be something for his family to read. She'd been working a year and a half on this project, and she had done about 11 pages or 8 pages and had 3 more pages to go. It was painstaking work. Well, I was really fascinated by this on a couple of different levels. One is, I went, what diary? I never heard anything about that. And I thought, this is an amazing thing. And it was never in the news. And I began to wonder. And the other thing that she said, which really struck me, was she was trying to take it apart, even though she read Hebrew, she was trying to take it apart in a way that would not require her to read it, because she felt that it was personal. And I thought, well, he's like a wonderful human being with this charitable act, really. In the end, she said that she had to read it in order for it to make any sense at all for her, for taking apart. But I immediately started Googling, or actually DuckDuckGoing, because we don't use Google. And it's like, what else fell there that I didn't know about? And how come I never heard any of this? And the more I did research, the more I discovered that, in fact, there was a great deal that fell and a great deal that happened that we never heard about, that never made it to the American consciousness. Papers in Houston and Dallas covered it more extensively than the national press. And the reason probably for that was a couple of reasons. One, the Columbia fell 6 weeks before the Iraq War started. So the reporters were there for about 2 weeks, the national reporters, and then they were all called home to cover the start up to the war. So we never heard a lot about the search that went on in East Texas for months. I mean, months. They were finding things. So that was considered one of the great underreported stories. The more I read about it, the more I was intrigued. Having been a journalist, I had a great love for underreported stories. And I thought, there is so much here that we never heard about. The other thing is a lot of what happened, particularly regarding the astronauts and the astronauts' remains, NASA is extremely sensitive about that kind of stuff. And they didn't talk to the reporters about that sort of thing, even though they were, people were finding that sort of stuff. NASA asked the people of East Texas not to talk about that sort of thing. And those folks tend to be politically and religiously conservative. And they are only about an hour and a half north of Houston. They considered themselves at that point part of the NASA family. So they didn't talk about it very much. Then they felt it was their duty, out of respect for the families, not to do that. So the more I read, the more intrigued I got. And by February or late January, I was on an airplane to East Texas. And then my only plan there was to go to the 3rd anniversary of the disaster. And, there were various towns that had anniversary memorial sort of remembrances. They were having them every year. So I picked one and went to it. When I first went down there, I didn't know if I was going to write fiction or nonfiction. Not exactly. I knew that there was a great nonfiction story to tell, but at that point I was writing fiction, and that was really where my heart was. And the thing that made me finally decide that I was going to write fiction was that the more I talked to people and the more I read about it, the more I realized there was almost nothing that I could make up that would be stranger than what actually happened. The stories that people told me were so bizarre and so fantastical in terms of the things that fell, the things that they found, and the way that they discovered them. The Columbia fell, scattered debris across about 250 miles of East Texas. That part of Texas is very rural. There's huge swaths of national forest there. It's very wooded. There's a lot of water. There's a lot of rain. They get 42 inches or more of rain every year. And you know, the recovery took probably the recovery of the actual astronauts' remains was probably concluded in about 2 weeks. They got that done as fast as they could, and that was their prime objective. But in terms of finding pieces of the shuttle, it went on for 6, 8 months, and still 2 and 3 years later, even 5 and 10 years later, they were finding pieces of the shuttle. NASA estimated about 25,000 people took part in the recovery of the debris. And that included NASA folks, that included the folks who lived there, that included many people who came in from out of town to help with the recovery. Everybody from Department of Corrections folks that they employed in Texas, from Texas, to firefighters from all over the country, Native American firefighters that you read about, the hot shots that go into fires. They all came to help. And it caused, of course, the population to swell. There was no place for them to stay. There was no way to feed them. I mean, literally, especially in the very beginning, before the federal government was able to mobilize, and it takes the federal government a while to mobilize, people did open their homes and they did cook for folks, and they did have big church suppers, and it was the best that they could do. And they, you know, emptied out all their grocery stores, they emptied out all their pantries, and they literally did try to take care of those folks themselves in the first few days. So one worry that I had when going down there was whether people would talk to me or not. I was used to having the institution of the newspaper behind me, but I quickly discovered, especially since once I decided I was writing fiction, I didn't need to write down everything that people said. People did talk, and I was down there, you know, 3 years after it happened. Some of them had been interviewed a lot, and they were very media savvy and somewhat suspicious. Other folks had never been asked about their experience, and they were more than happy to tell me about it, because it was, they went through something that no one else in this country has ever been through. And they realized that, and they, you know, they wanted to tell someone about it, the noises that they heard, and depending on where they were, they had different experiences in terms of what they heard and what they saw. The debris fell for about 30 minutes. So some of them saw a lot, some of them didn't see much. Some of them heard one kind of noise, some of them heard a different kind of noise. I came across a woman who remembered hearing a whooshing sound and looked out her bedroom window, and she saw something. She didn't know what it was, but she heard this whooshing sound. We don't know what it was. It could have been what commonly referred to as the nose cone of the shuttle, which did land, you know, in her town somewhere, not near her house. But it had to fly by some people's houses on its way into the woods. So the research was, it was a lot of fun. It was really, really intense. People were talking about finding parts of the astronauts' bodies and what that was like. And you know, even though some folks told me in the beginning no one was going to talk to me about that, time had passed. I was down there for about 5 days in February of 2006, and then in November of that year, I went back and stayed for 2 weeks, which was when I did most of my research, really getting a sense of the lay of the land and what the experience was like for them. So I came back, and I have to say, writing the first sections of the book were hard. I was working on another project at the time, so I had to kind of put it aside, but I also had so much information and so much information about what had really happened. And I didn't want to write what had really happened. So I kind of just let it stew for a little while. They had told me remarkable stories, and I needed to find my own stories out of that. I didn't want to write their stories, and there's no person that I actually spoke to who is in the book. They may be disappointed about that, but there are no real people in the book except, Neil Armstrong or people that I made occasional reference to. So gradually I found my own stories. The first one took a really long time, and then there were some, life events, and I had to set my work aside. And then when I actually started writing the bulk of the book, I spent a very intense about year and a half writing. And then, that wasn't all of it, but that was when most of it happened. I feel like the Columbia was kind of a disaster that got lost in between the two pillars of catastrophe in our history. And one was 9/11. And 9/11 happened about 18 months before the Columbia fell. And then there was the Iraq War. And so this disaster kind of fell in the middle, inside of those two. And, a lot of its history has been lost. NASA holds a Day of Remembrance, which they did yesterday, once a year in late January for all three of their disasters. And yesterday they remembered the Apollo 1 fire that took 3 astronauts' lives in 1967. And then they remember the shuttles, the Columbia and the Challenger. It's still hard for people there in East Texas to come to terms with what happened to them. When I went to a little town remembrance, that first February that I went there, I was taken to the, I was hanging around. I was hanging around this remembrance, and I was kind of hanging around till the end. And there were 2 women there, and they said, "Would you like to see where the nose cone fell?" And I said, "Of course, yes." And these women were 2 women who had, led sort of low-profile lives. And then when this thing happened to them, they were 2 people who stepped up, and one of them had been in charge of the media for her county, and she was a forest worker. She worked for the Park Service, and another one ran a restaurant, and she decided to feed people. So they had fairly prominent roles, and they had been thrust into the limelight. And they said, "Well, we'll take you." And they put me in their SUV, and they turned around, and they said to me, "So who are you really?" Because they smelled a reporter. And I said, "Well, yes, yeah, I used to be, but I'm writing fiction this time." But they took me to where it happened and told me what happened to them. And one of them, her name is Marcia. Marcia, when it happened, drove out onto the roads and in this particular national forest. And she was with a couple of folks who were going to look into what had happened. There had been reports of debris in this particular area. And they got out of the car and they started walking, and they said, "Stop and look, it's all around us." And it was all around us. And the particular pair of boots that she was wearing that day, she burned them that night because of what she had been walking through. It was so distressing to her. It was, you just can't imagine. It was not as though NASA had ever prepared for this kind of disaster. They had prepared for disasters upon launch, and they had prepared for disasters upon landing. But this kind of thing that scattered debris and astronauts' remains, they'd never imagined would happen. And so they didn't really know how to deal with it. When I wrote the book, I was writing a collection of stories, and the book is often referred to as a collection of stories. And in fact, that was its origins. But when it was accepted at Hub City, they said, we'd like to make it one of our lead titles, but we can't do that if it's a collection of stories. We need to market it as a novel. And they asked me to write about 25 more pages and to knit it together a little more closely, which I did and was happy to do. It's a little uncomfortable marketing it as a novel. I thought, well, people realize I'm a fraud. I haven't really written a novel. And as one of my friends said, you wrote a novel without even realizing you're writing a novel. You lucky dog. And I said, well, yeah. But they felt that it worked. And it was, right after Olive Kitteridge came out, that they were talking about this, and they said, they point to that book and they say, here she does it. Elizabeth Stroud writes a collection of stories, and they put novel label on it, and there you have it. And I noticed that she's just done it again with her book Olive Again. If any of you have read that, it's really a series of stories. I mean, it says right there on the cover that it's a novel. So as a writer, that was a leap that I kind of had to get over. But I'm glad that I did, because I was happy for it to be a lead title. I don't know, Alice, what else do you think people want to know about? I'm sort of babbling.
Yeah, well, I was also frustrated that NASA knew that there was possible disaster on their hands at the launch.
Yeah.
They didn't do anything about it, and they didn't tell the astronauts. And I just think that's so frustrating. Then after everybody died, they went, "Oh, I guess now we have to fix things and make things a lot better." And I don't know if you
Yeah.
want to speak about that. And I have a few other things, but that just popped in my mind as a frustrating NASA thing.
Yeah. There were one or two people, and possibly even more, who were people who were underlings when they saw what had happened on that launch and they reviewed the video. There were some people who were suspicious that that could cause a problem. But most of their engineers felt that it would not. And in fact, felt even after the disaster that that could not have been the problem. The problem was that a piece of foam came off on launch and hit the Columbia in a vulnerable spot. These literally are pieces of foam, and it was about the size of a briefcase or a carry-on. And they're fairly lightweight. They're foam, and they're cover the thing, and they're skin. And people said, "Gee, it's just a thin little thing." When they did tests after it was all over, and they went into their wind tunnel and they took a piece of foam, just like what came off, and they shot it at 500 some miles per hour at the skin of the reconstructed shuttle. And they realized then how a very thin little piece of, even if it would have been a piece of paper, a very thin little piece shot at that force could do some serious damage. But it wasn't until they did those tests, and there were some people who said, this is just not possible that this was it, until they did those tests, that everybody went, oh, I guess it is.
Kathryn, could I
yeah.
ask you a question?
Yeah, please do.
Could you just kind of put me in historical perspective? When was the Challenger versus the Columbia? I remember the Challenger was the O-rings, and that was, of course, horrible. But the foam always seemed to me like, this is nuts. You're right.
Yeah, the Challenger was in 1986.
Okay.
So the Columbia was in 2003.
Yeah.
So the shuttle ran for a long time. And as you may recall, the whole idea of the shuttle was that it would be routine, that it would take off and it would land. And, unlike earlier launches, it would not be a big deal. We would not see it all televised. We would not, it would just go and it would come back, and the same piece of equipment would be used. The Columbia had been used, I don't remember how many times, but there were quite a few astronauts that had been on the Columbia. And it was probably nearing the end of its useful life, but it was a warhorse. And that was the whole idea. And so, most of us weren't even aware first of all, that it was going to come down that day, because it had been going and coming and going and coming, and it was no longer a big deal. So, you know, there's some NASA geeks that knew all the time where it was coming, where it was going, when it would be flying over what part of the country. And some people would go out and they could actually watch it, especially in that part of the country, they could watch it go over. But the folks, you know, in Texas, they were pretty used to having it come over. And, you know, it's not that they didn't stop what they were doing, like, oh, you know, it was routine. And, you know, that's part of the reason that we kind of went, you know, didn't even know it was happening. So, yeah. What else, Alice?
Well, I felt right away that there was a dark conspiracy theory, and I'm not into a lot of them. I have like two main ones. Most of my friends know what the other one is, but but I felt something was weird. There was hush hush. There was quiet. There was not enough reporting, and I felt something was happening. And then there was also the talk of the Israeli astronaut, which, you know, most of that was just, you know, baloney. But there was something happening, and I knew. And then as soon as I saw the News and Observer doing a review piece on your book, I was like, I gotta read Kathryn's book, you know, because I was just so happy you wrote it. And that's the truth. I didn't know who you were or anything. I just have to. Oh, she's a North Carolinian. Oh my gosh! But and I was so excited when you sent me that email that you wanted to be a part of book club, you know, years and years ago. But would you mind talking a little bit about that, because your reporter instincts were right on, and
Yeah.
I appreciate what you said about the 18 months prior 9/11 and the 6 weeks forward.
Yeah.
Iraq, and that helps me put things in perspective. And also reading the book, how the stories were that so much happened, but all the residents were told to shh, shh, you can't talk.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Um, there was a lot in that question. I'm backing up to the beginning of that question. Oh, well, one of the reasons I knew it would be difficult for me to write nonfiction, aside from the fact that what I wanted to write was fiction, is I didn't have an in with NASA. And there was no way that I was going to get the kind of information that I really wanted from them, you know. And I'm going to tell you, this is a book called Bringing Columbia Home, which was written by a man from Greensboro named Jonathan Ward, co-written with the retired NASA launch director. And if you are a space geek, if anybody out there is a space geek, this is really a well-written book and a really good read, I thought. And it came out just before mine. And that is the book that has, you know, all the true facts, which are just as amazing, you know. And I found it fascinating. And the thing about that book is I didn't know he was working on it. And you know, when I first started working on, actually I submitted this book, and I saw an allusion to this book somewhere, and I go, oh, well, that could be trouble. And I put it out of my head. Somebody was actually writing the nonfiction version of you know, what I had fictionalized. And the book came out about 6 months before mine. I had sent my book, not to the printer yet, but the final version had gone to the publisher. And I realized that book was out, and I raced to the library, and the library had a copy of it, a new copy of it. And I, you know, literally read it in about 2 days, looking for the thing that I had gotten terribly wrong. Even though my book is fiction, I wanted it to be grounded in some sort of basic facts. And, you know, I felt okay. And Jonathan and I are friends now, and we've talked about our various experiences, and we even talked to some of the same people in Texas. That book is written with the former director of the launch, former NASA launch director. And it really gives you the idea of how they felt about the astronauts' bodies and the sensitivity to the astronauts' families. And, you know, my book doesn't skirt that. And even though all of my astronauts are fictional, the very idea of having astronauts strewn across the land in pieces is so unappealing and so distressful. They really didn't want anybody to know. They literally referred to them as items of interest in talking to the media, and kept them as far distant as they could. But it was a little bit distressing to me as a reporter to know that I was not going to have all of the facts, but I wanted to make sure that I had enough of the facts where it counted, how many miles up, how fast was it going, those types of things, that there would be sort of a grounding in my book, in fact, so that when people read my book, they would have a sense of what happened, what actually happened.
You'd think that NASA would be more truthful about things, and say, this is what happened, and because of the problems prior with in 1986 and
Well,
all the
they
cover-ups,
the
it would be
yeah,
more open.
the Columbia accident report is pretty truthful and pretty nitty gritty and actually kind of heartbreaking to read,
Okay.
because they went back and they reconstructed everything they took GPS of where everything fell, and they took it all back to a hangar, and they reconstructed based on the trajectories of what fell where. They reconstructed the whole thing down to the minute and down to who was alive when and what probably happened to them.
Oh.
And it's public information. But a lot of NASA is PR. A great deal of what the astronauts do is PR, and it's out of sensitivity to the families. It's not out of wanting to hide from America what really happened. It's really, it's a family, and there were small children involved, and they lost their parents, and they really want to take care of those folks emotionally as best they can. Yeah.
Well, let's switch gears and talk about your book. So your characters are. I'd love to know how you got the ideas for your characters. Some of my favorite. I love Carter, and the bad guy, Newland, how he was horrible, and he would be. And I love how at the beginning of the book you mention. So we have names coming at us and we don't know who they are. But then you read the book and you go, oh well. Then you backtrack and you're like, oh well, they're that was that guy or that girl or that kind of thing, and then Eve in the assisted living center, she was so such a personality, and then her husband, all the residents are thinking, okay, why is she going back to Lenny? So I just would love to know how all these characters formed and the inspiration. They were really great stories. Really great stories.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of characters in the book, and there's not as many as there were when I first submitted it. As Hub City said, well, we think you have too many, and so there's some of them had to be combined. I was inspired by the people I met there. Not some of their stories, some anecdotes that I heard kind of show up in different ways in the book. Just a kind of sense of who the people are, and all the sort of melding of the community. I was really struck by the class and racial stratification of East Texas. I mean, I haven't spent any time in the Deep South and never really wanted to. And in fact, when I first started thinking about writing this book, I wondered if I could move the shuttle disaster out of the Deep South, because I didn't want to write about the Deep South. But it was really fascinating in terms of especially the race and class segregation down there. So I made an effort to try and tell a story of a town. So there are a lot of characters, and some making sort of cameo appearances, but I wanted that sense of the community, because it was the community that had to deal with the disaster and dealing with it in very different ways. This really was a white man's disaster. The last thing that part of East Texas has the African-American community has a sort of troubled relationship with the white community, and especially law enforcement there, as you can imagine. There had been a tremendous drug problem in one particular town that I went in. There'd been a huge historical monumental drug bust, but the people who went to jail were the Black folks. The white people who were behind it didn't go to jail. So there's tremendous resentment. So the last thing I imagine that the African-American community wanted to do was to join forces with the law enforcement searching for pieces of the shuttle. So they had a different view of it, and they were really outside of the disaster, and I wanted to kind of get that across, and not just write one group's story. They really were inspired. Carter was inspired by a woman that I met there, not her story, but I walked into a store one day, and I remember I had been kind of driving around all day, and I was really tired, and I really just wanted to go back to my little hovel and write up what I had been seeing all day. But I saw this store, and I said, I think I'll go in and just chat. And various people came in. I was probably there for an hour and a half, maybe even longer, just kind of hanging out, getting a feel for that place and the feel for the people who came in there. And that was the inspiration for that story. The story of, it's really terrible when you haven't talked about your book in so long, you forget the names of the characters. So the story, the section about, I'm supposed to refer to them as chapters, but they're not. Against the Sky was inspired by an anecdote that someone told me, and I don't even know if it was true. I have a feeling it actually might not have been, but it felt true. I discovered later that she told me some things that weren't true. So I'm skeptical of everything that she told me, but she told me an anecdote, and I go, huh. And that stayed with me, and it turned into a story. Or a section of the book. So, I just try to think widely. I had some advice partway through the book when someone said to me, you've got all these good characters in here. When you've got that one, Newland, he needs his own story. And I said, oh, yes. Unfortunately, that's true. So I had to write that, which was, one of the least fun sections that I wrote.
You did it very, very well.
Thank you. It seemed a monumental task to get inside the head of a pervert. So thanks.
Congratulations.
I didn't know anyone to talk to about it.
But it's sad, Suzanne's story, how her daughter, we see her daughter's drawings on the fridge, and then we find out later the daughter's tragic ending, and then we find out the mother's tragic ending. But I like how, it's your sections are chronological, where you can figure out where things go, and they build on each other. And I thought it was a very smart move to start in the store, so that when you're in a retail space, you have people come to you.
Yeah.
That was just really smart of
yeah, that seemed, after I wrote that seemed like that was going outside of the prologue-ish sort of intro. That seemed like that was a good place to start.
Yeah.
Also, the beginning of that story is sort of distanced. That section is kind of distanced, and you kind of zero in on the storage. You start back here and you come in, and yeah.
And I like how Jerome is an African American fellow, and Carter seems to have a little crush on him.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so and the racial makeup you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, a really interesting aspect of the disaster was that it brought a lot of people from outside of East Texas, which is a fairly insular place, brought a lot of people in to that area. And East Texas had never seen those folks before, and those folks had never seen East Texas before. I was always struck by the idea of an African-American astronaut landing in a place where there was so much oppression of the African-American community, and how that, just the irony of all of that.
Yeah. Folks, well, I feel like I've spoken enough. Let me go ahead and get everybody back to the gallery view. Well, this is a good time, since we have most of us here. If you could turn your screens on, we can do a quick group photo and show me your best smiles. Okay. So if it's possible for you to open your screen up, and here we go. Well, we'll wait for Renee. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And go ahead and smile. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. And what other questions do you have, friends?
I want wanted to comment. I just wanted to tell you, first of all, I loved the characters and I
Oh,
loved
thank
the
you.
names of the characters. I thought
Thank
that
you.
was so creative. And those final two chapters in the book, the final two very short chapters, I just love those so much, and I could just read those again and again, and I think I will. The two
Thank you.
perspectives on the stars and the space. They were just so beautiful.
Thank you. They were gifts. I have to say that. Sometimes you get a gift.
Well, they were a gift to me too. So thank you.
Thanks.
Kathryn, I just wanted to mention that your writing is just poetic. I loved your turn of,
Thank you.
and you make other authors say, man, I wish I'd said that. And, at the end of each chapter, it was very open-ended, and I expected it to be all tied up neatly at the end of the book. But the ambiguity was just so brilliant. It just made me come away from there saying, well, that was just a character study, and I just want to know where these people are going. I love the way you left us hanging, but I still want a sequel.
It's always nice. I think it's nice to leave your reader wanting more, even if you're never going to be able to deliver it to them.
Well,
Yeah.
you did. It was beautifully written.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me coming from writers.
Kathryn, you were working with a small press out of South Carolina. How was that experience? What did you think about that?
I was extremely fortunate to land with that press. Like a lot of people, as people do, I sent the book around to a lot of contests, a lot of short story contests. I mean, it went around, other presses, other really wonderful small presses for several years. The way that happened, I'd been sending it out probably more than 3 years. And I sent it to Hub City during their open reading period. They work with people who have agents, and then they open it up, or they were opening it up for a month of open reading period. And I sent it on, I think, the last day, next to the last day, and 10 o'clock at night, I sent it. And I walked into the bedroom and said to my husband, I am never doing this again. And what I meant was I was never writing a collection of stories again. I was done. I was so done with sending it out that this was, all a terrible mistake. By 10 o'clock the next morning, I had an email from them asking to see the manuscript. I had sent them an inquiry, a query letter. So by 10 o'clock, and in 5 days, they offered me a contract.
Wow.
Yeah. And, this is what, people can say this till they're blue, and no one believes it. It has to fall into the right hands, and someone has to fall in love with it. And that is just not predictable. And there is no way to know when and if that's going to happen. They were wonderful. They do everything right. And I, of course, asked folks a lot of questions. They gave me the names of 2 of their authors and the contact information and said, if you want to call them and ask them what we're like, you can do that. And so I did that. They work like dogs. They're a very small operation. Their books are handsome. They keep their people in print. They are big on promotion, and you can't say that about a lot of small presses. They are financially healthy, tremendously supported by Spartanburg, and now even people like Charles Fraser. But it's because they've always done quality work. They are responsive, responsible, and care a lot about what they're doing. So I can't say enough good things about them. I was just really, really, really lucky. And I didn't know. I had read one of the books that they had published, and I didn't like it that much. And I thought, I don't know if that's the place for me. And it absolutely was. So,
that's great. Thanks.
yeah.
I have another question in terms of the Columbia itself. I seem to recall historically that at first the there was a lot of onus on NASA that this was actually an old system in terms of the launch and the use of carrying the, you know, the shuttle and so on and so forth. And there was a lot, at first there was blame on NASA, but then that was not the case because of what they discovered, and everyone was really shocked. I do things differently than many in our group, because usually I buy the book and read it after the author has shared, and because I love to get the preview from the author.
Uh-huh.
But I also will get that book on Bringing Columbia Home, Kathryn. Thank you for sharing that, because I think there'll be a wonderful parallel.
Oh, I think you'll enjoy reading both of them together. Yeah. One of the things that came out of the discussions after the Columbia accident report was that there's a tremendous hierarchy at NASA. And one of the things they learned is that maybe they should listen to the people who are a little farther down, because some of those folks said, we might have a problem here, but they couldn't make themselves heard above the ceiling where they were. And so the message really never got through. And that's one of the things that I think NASA has learned, to be a little bit more open, and it's not to be quite so hierarchical. That's one thing that came out of it. And it's NASA's been that way. Probably other government agencies are too. It's been that way for a really long time. Yeah. You get in Jonathan's book, you really get a sense of how NASA works. Now, there's nothing in that book that's particularly not much in that book that's particularly critical of NASA, unless Mike Leinbach, who is the retired launch director that he wrote the book with, unless he wants to point something out about something. And he is inclined to say, I was one of the people who was skeptical, who honestly believed there could be a problem. But, a lot of that is hindsight. Everybody would prefer to be on that side of the fence at this point. So, but yeah, I think you'll enjoy it.
Well, and the other question I had, our own Alice Irby has written and published a memoir, a collection of personal stories, which has been wonderful this past year. And it just struck me that your genre is almost like a fictional memoir, which is really interesting. I never even thought of anything like that before, but that's fun.
Yeah. I don't know, Alice, what do you think?
Well, I thought about that. It is factual as far as my memory serves me. In that sense, it is nonfiction. However, some of the characters and some of the stories could be fiction. And when my mentor, the man that got me to do it in the first place, really said that I should try fiction, because some of the stories read as if they're fiction. So, but I haven't had the courage to do that yet. This was my one shot. and now I'm working on another nonfiction thing about my hometown. I was encouraged to write a short history of my hometown by John Clark here, who is just retired from NC State. He grew up in a little town not far from my hometown, and he had written a short history of Vaughan, the place at the crossroads. So he and the mayor of Weldon sort of encouraged me or pushed me gently.
Yeah.
However, what I've decided to do is to use the historical fact as the framework, and I'm going to write stories about families in that town at different points in time. So I may turn it into a kind of semi-fictional thing, depending on how much information I can get. But I want to go back to your characters, because like Paget, I felt that I was left hanging at the end of each story. And like Paget, I thought you were going to put it all together at the end. And so I continued to, I'm still left hanging. So like her, I'd like to see it all tied together. However, I want you to tell us how you what the inspiration was for Rose, because I thought she was the most positive character, and I could see her holistically in a way that I couldn't see some of the others.
That's interesting. Thank you. Um, you know, it's always, I think it's always a gamble to be writing outside yourself so much, be writing about quote unquote the other. And I gave a lot of thought to her. Originally, she was in the nursing home story as she was just making that cameo appearance. But she began to grow in that story the more that I thought about this particular aspect of East Texas that I wanted to write about, which was the racial and class segregation. I don't know anybody like her. She just began to grow out of the contrast with Pauline, I think.
Right.
Pauline had an opinion of her, which was not, in my opinion, is not really accurate.
Right.
But that's what she thought, and she dismissed her. And so I felt like giving her her own space, and in particular, I was actually daunted by the prospect of having her in conversation with an old white guy. But I said, this gets to the heart of one of the things that you want to write about. So, try it, try it, and put them together and see what happens.
I thought it was very good. I was touched by her character, and I liked the way you used the Sparks name and had her end up with the old white man. I thought that was quite touching, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a big fan of Henry Louis Gates's program, Finding Your Roots.
Mhm.
And, you find out even with Henry Louis Gates and his Irish ancestors that we really are all related. And in this part of the country, even more so, in ways that nobody necessarily wants to talk about. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to ask my famous question. Thank you.
Okay, Tracy.
For being here, Kathryn. So I actually am going to add on to my famous question.
Okay.
That sounds so arrogant. Sorry about that. The one I usually ask, and that's what your favorite sentence from the book? And then the second one I've been thinking a lot about is what part or aspect of this book do you think it's overlooked? I mean, people love the characters, people love the plot, but what's something that you're really proud of? And you're like, nobody really talks about that, but I'm really proud of this. So those are my two questions.
Thank you for asking that. I am going to tell you, I don't know that I can think of a sentence that would be my favorite sentence. Yeah, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go there. I do, when I read from the book, I like to read the opening and I like to read the ending. And those are two things that I'm really proud of. So, and I think they read, they're fun to read. They're fun for me to read. And my husband, God love him, he is not a consumer of literature, but he has heard me read that opening, countless times on book tour. And he said to somebody, and I only overheard him, he didn't say this to me, I've heard her read that so many times and I never get tired of it. And I just went, whoa, I've really done something now. So I thank you for asking about the overlooked section, because the story that technically I'm proudest of is the one that no one ever talks about. And that is the section called From a Distance, about the older man telling the story of the younger man on the search. And I, for some reason, that section does not stick in people's minds. But the reason that it sticks in my mind is because technically it was a challenging story to write, because I'm writing a story of a man telling a story about someone else, and he wasn't there. And yet he knows and enters the mind of this young man on this search. And it took me a long time to pull that off. And that section had a life as a short story in which, people said to me, oh, it's 2 stories. It doesn't work. This doesn't work. And I had to really, really work at the technical moments. And I can even tell you exactly where they are, where those 2 stories had to come together in a way that would make it work, but would not scream, look, these stories are coming together, And so technically it was really hard. And I was absolutely jubilant when I thought I had found it, and I didn't know, and I had to keep shoving people's way and saying, does this work? Does this work? Have I done it now? And I go, no. Have I done it now? No. So thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm watching as I mentioned the section of that title, and if I'm describing it and I'm looking at people's faces, and not that many people are nodding. So
I wanted to say I recognize the technical skill that you took with that story right away.
Thank
And,
you.
Yeah,
Course,
and
my readers aren't writers.
I enjoyed it. I love the tension, especially like what is James gonna do, and then he takes the nematodes and the life, and then he gets in trouble, and it's just more. It's a layered story that we're not expecting. But I wrote a song that is a multi-layer song that took months and months, and I based it on when I discovered my husband had cancer, and then it had this emotional tie to it, and then I had to tie it back together, and it's the song that I'm most proud of, and it's called "The Snow Won't Ever Melt," and it also has a very technical riff to it, which took a while to. It's like I need to be more technically proficient. It took a lot of practice, all that stuff, and it took a lot of time, to put together. But I felt like a writerly sister with you on this one.
I think we are.
I did. I was like, she must have spent so much time trying to get the names right, get the situations right. When she says when she writes that sentence, it has to be so dense and so compact that it makes complete sense. And it all has, because I totally, kudos to you. I recognize that as a fellow author.
Thank you. Yeah, I felt like I had to channel Chekhov, and that is not an easy thing to do.
No, it's not.
And sometimes it's Alice Munro, sometimes it's Chekhov, and I'm like, I'm not that good. Come on, I can't do this. So I wasn't sure I could pull that off ever.
And I wanted to, and I hate to disagree with my fellow members, but I respectfully disagree that some folks have said that it was, they wanted more to the stories. I felt you ended the stories very well, because if you're a reader of short stories, a lot of times the short story just ends like right before the conflict, and then there's no denouement, it just ends. And I read a collection where almost every story ended, half the book ended before it should have ended, because I don't know if the writer was lazy, or they thought that would be left to the reader's imagination, kind of like the movie Soul, where you're like, well, is the main character going to do this, or he's going to do that? But I never felt that way reading your book. I felt it was enough for me. I knew where they were going. I knew there was still more for them to go. Sort of like at the end of Sideways, what Paul Giamatti's character, he's going up to his love's door, and then the movie ends. So you're like, okay, well, that's how I felt about your book. Like, we know that where they're moving towards, we don't know how it's going to end, but we know they're either in that place or that place.
Yeah.
So that's how I felt personally, and I wanted to share that.
Thank you. I like to write an ending that falls on the cusp of change.
Yeah, cusp of change. Thank you.
Yeah, it is really, you don't need to, I don't want to nail it down.
Yeah. I'm taking that with me. I'm writing that down, cusp of change.
Yeah, it came from a writer named Deborah Monroe, as long as if you want to attribute it. And I don't know where she got it, probably someone, but she was a wonderful, very early teacher of mine.
Okay.
And who used to talk about that.
Thank you.
Kathryn, I'm Jorge Cortés. I wanted to thank you for the collection. Usually when I approach a series of short stories, you wanted to call them a novel, I expect like different worlds that are coming in each of them. And I thought it was a lot more difficult to do what you did. It sort of reminded me of a book that was influential to me and then to my children. It's called Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. In which the individual stories are stories, But there is a second story that is us moving to Mars, and then there is a third story. My children did appreciate that very much. I probably didn't notice it at the time that I read it, but there is this whole genre of short stories that happen in a certain world and tell us different things than just the stories. And I think your
Yeah.
book is fascinating because there is a whole other story happening outside the individual lives that they are touched. And we don't call them novels, and in some sense they are not exactly a collection of short stories. It's sort of more ambitious what you did, that is to link that to that world that exists overall, not just towns, but also what is happening with the Columbia disaster. And I thought that was a very interesting way to look at them. And I disagree that it's a novel. I think it's a short story collection, but it's also a little world where they happen. And it reminds me of Martian Chronicles in that sense. A
Thank
book
you.
where I do remember the second story more than actually the short stories themselves. And over time, I do remember that feeling of what happened, that feeling of that moment. You know, that is what I remember, that memory.
Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of, in order to call it a novel, I mean, it creates a world, and it has, the sum of the parts has to mean something. And, they were hoping that the sum of these parts would mean something. Yeah. What else can I tell you? Yeah, Mariana. I think you're on mute. All of you are.
Mariana, there you go.
Thank you. I have a question about publishing. When you said that night you sent your query letter to Hub City and you weren't going to do that again, did you have a plan? What were you going to do after that?
My plan was to not write short stories ever again. Because I had been sending it out as a story collection, and I had sent it, if you write short stories, all the contests, all over the country.
Right.
And beyond those contests, there is not much market for short stories if you have never published a book. And I said, well, this has got to be the dumbest thing I ever did. I should have just written a novel. And I didn't want to write, I wanted to write all these other voices. I couldn't, and that's what I meant. So I didn't have a plan except not ever to write a story collection again.
Well, good thing that came. Good thing you got an okay.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's so trite, but people say, oh, it's, darkest before the storm. I mean, people talk about, and I always thought, oh yeah, this is such a romantic notion. I was at the depths of despair, and then, I got an agent, or then, something happened. And I don't think I was despairing, but I certainly was frustrated, deeply frustrated at that moment, and really wanting, to give up. So anyway, it's a moral there.
Good. Yeah. Thank you. You stuck with it.
Yeah. The other part of me says, if I'd made it longer to begin with, as they required that I do, maybe it would have done better. I always hindsight. Was it too short? Is that the reason they were all rejecting it? I don't know. Nobody bothered to tell me. You never know. They say, not interested.
Yeah, you're a role model for sticking with your book and what you wanted to do. Really, that is great to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think the subject matter is excellent, with having the historical perspective of, having all the voices see the shuttle, as the main, the main object, and then where it's set. So I felt it was an very original concept that nobody else has done. But it also goes into disaster stories. I've seen poetry collections of, aftermath of tornadoes or hurricanes, and then you get the different voices from the characters. So I felt, if there's a disaster genre, I felt that's where it ended up. And I would say it definitely falls into historical fiction, because this is historical. I mean, I know you wrote it; it wasn't 8 years, but I'm writing historical fiction, and I appreciate all the extensive research and on the ground research you did, because it comes through. You can smell the smells and taste and the touch right off the page, Kathryn.
Yeah, there actually is. You could collect. In fact, somebody did collect them in some books into a syllabus, a college teacher into a syllabus and taught a course on these disaster stories,
Oh,
disaster books. Yeah. Yeah. And I did a presentation at AWP after the book came out, and I had to find writers who had done the similar thing to me as write about real events, all of them tragic real events. And it was interesting to see how many there actually were.
because it's really talking about pain and it's talking about trauma, and most fiction is pain and is trauma, and that's why we're drawn to, how to
Yeah.
move toward that. And yeah, I seem to be drawn to weather-related trauma.
When I was at the newspaper, they called me the tornado czarina because we would have tornadoes. We had tornadoes and hurricanes, and and for some reason, because I was on what we called then the state desk, they were not necessarily happening in Charlotte except for Hugo. They were happening around the state, and so that seemed to be how I made my way at the paper.
But that's how you find how people are either they're resilient and they step up in a heroic fashion, or they
Yeah.
shrink into a shell of themselves.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating to just look at the human condition. How
Yeah.
do people react, and how would you? And then it always goes back to you or the
Yeah.
reader. What would
Yeah.
you do if you found a body part on your
Yeah.
property, and how would you manage
One of the
that?
people one of the people I'm most grateful to in East Texas was a man that I met by chance. I drove into this town and didn't know anybody. And so I stopped at the Chamber of Commerce and told them what I was doing. And they said, you need to go talk to so-and-so. He was a county extension agent. And they told me where his office was. And I walked into his office and he wasn't there, but his secretary said, oh, he's out feeding the horses. Let me get him for you. And I go, oh, but she called him up and told him there's this woman here writing about the shuttle. Why don't you come talk to her? And so he came back. And this guy on that Saturday morning was out barbecuing. They were going to have a big, I don't know, a fundraising kind of barbecue. And so he was outside and they had this fundraising barbecue that day. And he told me what that was all like. But the next morning, when he realized that NASA needed people to go out and search, and they were asking, big billboards, they were asking people to go out. And he started calling all his friends that had been at the barbecue. And, some of them were hungover. It was a big deal. And none of them wanted to get up early on a Sunday morning and go out and search for debris. And so he called his 4-H'ers, and his 4-H'ers went and got their horses and went out and searched for debris. And it was the kids who came through for him. And this really affected him, the fact that his friends didn't want to that morning.
Wow.
But his kids did. Yeah.
Right, because it was Sunday morning. The disaster was Saturday morning.
Yeah. And he almost had tears in his eyes when he was telling me about this. Yeah.
So do y'all out there, do you remember the disaster when it happened on the news? Do you all remember, I'll just put everybody in gallery view. I guess raise your hand if you were there, you remember you were watching the news. Yeah.
Alice, the interesting thing is, as Kathryn said, these things had become almost routine. And so just as the people in the area, maybe sensed, oh, it's flying over, but didn't stop to watch. That was kind of where I was at that point too. That's why I think it was all the more shocking, because they, you couldn't call them commonplace because they were major, launches and events, but they had just been doing it. Mm-hmm. So when that exploded like that, it was just horrendous.
Yeah, remember when it was a big deal when there were astronauts in orbit over Earth. And I personally had forgotten that there was a crew up there.
Yeah.
We had forgotten that there they were. It was no longer a big deal.
And I wanted to say also, I'm glad that you said it and brought up 9/11, and that it was 18 months after 9/11.
Yeah.
Well, I was living near Annapolis, Maryland, and the previous October 2002, we had just come off of the trauma of the DC sniper. So as a community in that area, we were all still on edge about that.
Yeah.
And, you know, with today's events unfolding so quickly and everything bombarding us daily, it's hard to think about it. But back then, 9/11, and then we were hit with the sniper, and then this happened. And I think the area in there was just, at least the circle that I ran in, we were all a little psychologically sunburned from these traumas.
Yeah.
So once it went off the radar, and then right into Iraqi war, I mean, you know, but I think it wasn't, and we were so far removed being in the DC area.
Right.
Annapolis is part of that. So it was maybe at that point, just not having that trauma in our face might have been a little bit of a relief. But I
Yeah.
remember thinking about, you know, I wish, what happened here? Like, what, was this like the Challenger? I mean, you know, I remember thinking those types of things. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah,
doing.
and I rounded up. I always rounded up to 18 months. It's technically 17 months after 9/11, but we were still in that mindset, still in that fear mindset. Remember that whole time until we went to war with Iraq, and you know, Bush was reminding us that these things were related, whether they were or not. So that whole 2 years of, you know, fallout from the terrorist attack.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for me, you know, the Challenger was the seminal milestone of my generation, and then I felt this, you know, the Columbia was. I was mad that there was not enough about it, and I already told you that, but I felt cheated that there was not enough, and I kept, you know, looking up and up, and perhaps it was distraction because my son was just you know, 5 months old at the time, but I was just seriously like, this is very frustrating, and I knew they were hiding something. I knew something wasn't right, and I'm very glad the commission came out with the details. But
Yeah, if you were living in Texas, you'd have heard a lot more about it. And it's interesting that outside of Texas, you really just didn't.
That's what frustrated me. Yeah, the national news was not there, and I recognized that. I said, there's something that's missing." You know, and I had saw that when DC, you know, with several things that came to mind. I won't go into that, but it was like, I read the reporting, you know, I read the newspaper, and then I see the story disappear, and then that's when I know there's something larger at stake happening, and I don't know what it is, but I note it in my mind because I'm a newspaper person. I just like to
Right.
to go into that.
Yeah. And unfortunately now, especially, it's now just a lack of resources.
Yeah,
It's not news judgment anymore. It's just a lack of resources, which is, you know, just sad.
yeah,
Just really sad.
that's really frustrating. So, what projects are you working on now?
Well, it's hard to define. But the subject that I'm sort of wallowing around in now is, I'm really fascinated with the idea of the families that are created from sperm and egg donors.
Hmm.
And the more research I do on that, the more interested I get. So I'm just the beginnings of writing something. I'm probably starting out with stories, and I don't know where it will lead. And I don't know whether that's something that's going to be in the foreground or the background, but it's really, really fascinating, and probably going to become fairly commonplace, but you know, just extraordinary, the things that are going on.
And will you fictionalize it once again, Kathryn, or?
I will, yeah.
Interesting, okay.
I will. The emotional content around it, you know, we don't have very many laws in this country that restrict the number of times a man's sperm can be used, for instance, of many of the strange things that are going on. And so you have people with, you know, a couple hundred half siblings in this country. And, you know,
Wow.
yeah, Yeah, and the whole idea now that you can have sperm and egg donor, and the creation of human beings these days, the act of creation is changing fairly rapidly, and we don't really know what the emotional consequences of all of that are. And with ancestry.com and other genealogy places, there are no secrets anymore. There were a couple of generations of folks who were created with donations during that time of secrets. And those secrets are being unveiled now. People in their 50s finding out, like Dani Shapiro wrote a book about finding out that her father was not her father. But there's lots of examples around that now, with older people discovering the truth of their lives well into their middle age. So I think, it's emotionally rich. It's sort of cool.
Like hooking up with your brother.
Yeah, there are children now who are the children of sperm donors now who have to know their donor number, because they will run into their siblings, or they may run into their siblings. And there's one, and probably more than one, they have it tattooed somewhere on them, their number, so that they don't ever forget, and that they'll know. Everybody needs to know their donor number now.
Wow.
Who would have thought?
Oh, I was thinking, there was one story in the book about that, because I finished the book. I stayed up all night reading it in December.
It's such a compliment.
I did. It was a Thursday night, and I remember we had our Orkin man, Neil, come on Friday morning, and I was all bleary-eyed and going, ugh. And then he's a space geek, and we were talking. I said, "You have to get Kathryn's book," and I gave him your card and everything, the Bug Man. But we, yeah, he's really into space. So the book that the story about the horse, the pony, and eating the bad hay really affected me. And I'm not a horse person, but maybe I am. I don't know. But I was really sad for the horse eating the bad hay, and I was really horrified that the horse wasn't getting enough nutrition. And that was the minister, Will Simpson,
Yeah.
or Wes. I'm sorry. Let me see.
It was Will, yeah.
Will, okay. And on page 176, poor guy, so more alfalfa pellets. How many bags? How many can we afford? He's going through one a week. And maybe I just was having flashbacks to our guinea pig, was going through all these pellets, and but how you wrote it really affected me emotionally, and I didn't think I was surprised how emotional I felt about this pony. So
thank you. I am a horse person.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, and in the original version of that section, the horse died.
Oh.
Thank God I found a way to resurrect him. I don't think I could have written that part. But it was hard for me to write about Roscoe not having enough to eat. But in fact, the drought was really bad down there, and those people without a lot of money were in dire straits, and they were abandoning animals, which happens up here even when there's no drought. But
right,
people treat their animals.
But how you wrote about it made me care deeply about Roscoe.
Oh, thank you. I cared about him too, but I, didn't want to kill him off.
Yeah, thank you. But I felt so mad that Will got cheated by the guy, Arthur Kenny. I'm like, he cheated you, dum-dum. He knew what he was doing.
Yeah.
What is a dime bag? I know that's meth, but what does it look like? I didn't know. I was trying to, and perhaps I should do my research.
Tracy's going to tell us what a dime bag really is.
Okay.
Because you're shaking your head, right?
Oh, my understanding is it's weed. I don't think it's meth.
Yeah.
But I mean, from what I've read.
Yeah. Yeah, a dime bag is a little bit of marijuana that doesn't cost very much. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's often how people kind of get into it. I mean, among friends, it's a very casual encounter.
Oh, okay.
A transaction. Yeah.
Yeah, dime bags came up a lot. Yeah. So I was like, oh, something I didn't know.
But I had to check around to make sure I was calling, the right thing by the right name. I never held one in my hands.
Well, this has been fantastic, and it's so great to get to know you. Isn't it wonderful to get to know someone over Zoom meeting?
You know, it was great for me. I didn't have to travel. I'm here in my bedroom. I don't like teaching on Zoom, but I think this is my first book club on Zoom. I think they're great.
They are.
I didn't have to get dressed. Dressed up. I'm dressed.
Kathryn, are you teaching
Thank
at
you.
Gardner Webb?
I am doing a day. I'm appearing in somebody's class. It's greatly reduced. It was going to be an on-campus visit and that sort of thing. So what I'm doing instead is I'm appearing in someone's class, and then and this is open to the public. There's some sort of all-campus appearance or larger appearance that's on February 25th at 4:00. It's not like a nighttime reading that it might have been, kind of open to the public. It'll be fun. And what they do is they assign the books to a number of English classes. So there were book sales involved, which was great. Yeah, it's gonna be really fun. I'm really grateful to them.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And then,
Yeah.
so for your next book, do you have a publisher, or are you not yet?
No, yeah, I'll start from scratch all over again. And Hub City is, they really like to publish first books. I don't know they'll be going forward, but that's been their pattern is to publish a lot of first books, except for, rare folks like George Singleton and, people that can make them some money. So yeah, we'll see. But it's going to be a long haul. I've had a very hard time writing this year. I don't know how it's been for the rest of you who are writers, but it's been very distracting. And, my husband and I are home in the house all the time, and that didn't used to be the case. And, it's just been hard. So I'm a little behind where I'd like to be. So anyway, thanks for asking.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you all so much.
I did a book over the pandemic. I started a book and then I hated where it was, and now I'm redoing my book. And I read it at an open mic and I got some good reactions. So so that's been my deadline. I have an open mic it's, the remote kind of deal with Chatham County
Right.
Library. They want, I debut a song and then I debut an excerpt, and the two are related. So I'm to each other, but I'm really glad.
Deadlines are good. Yeah, I've just set myself another deadline in March to have it done, have this particular section done. I don't do much without deadlines. And I think, unfortunately, I guess I was a newspaper reporter and editor for too long. So I don't know, how are the rest of you? Are the rest of you writing? Those of you who are writers, are you managing? Yeah, Paget, you did. Lots of downtime. That's good.
Yeah, not much luck early in the pandemic, but then, got into a better routine.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been up and
Found
down.
I've been really productive. I think it's the angst and the stress has kind of gotten the juices flowing.
Oh, that's good. Are any of you putting the pandemic into your work? I am. And I'm wondering if anybody else is doing that. Since I was starting a new project, I decided.
Good idea.
Yeah, not in a big way, but it's background, we're all living through it.
Yep.
It changes things.
Tim has a question about the audiobook, Kathryn.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tim.
Hi, sorry, I didn't read the book. I listened to the audio on Libro.
Oh, did you like it?
Well, that's my question, because just to give you a little history about me, I also make films, and I had a couple actors approach me about doing the audio version of my book, and it's been kind of an interesting thing. So I really enjoyed, and your book is unique in the sense that you had different actors doing the audio, which I thought was and I thought was a very effective tool. So did you select the actors, or did you come up with that strategy? Or I thought it was really well done. I thought it really kind of brought home the different perspectives in each story.
Yeah. Blackstone did a wonderful job with the audio. I sold them the rights, and they came up with the idea of doing it, what they call ensemble, which was new to me. I didn't know people were doing that, and it was a surprise to me. They did a wonderful job of selecting folks, and the only thing I was allowed to give input, on the voices. And so what they did was they sent me snippets of the actor's work, other work, and asked me what I thought. It's kind of approval, but I mean, you know, you don't get to say, you really don't have approval, but they invite your input. And I had trouble with one of the voices, and it was the woman who was playing Carter. And that particular voice, and you know, my husband and I both listened to it, and I wrote them back and I said, I don't think she's right. And here's why. And they changed it and they sent me somebody else. And it was that person was of the same sensibility, which kind of bothered me a little bit, but I was worried about fake East Texas accents and stuff like that, but I liked her better. So I said, okay. There are two voices on there that just blew me away. And one is the African-American man, and the other is the African-American woman. And she read Pauline and Rose, and he read that one whole story. And I think that's his main front. He brought things into that section that when I heard it, I didn't realize were there. It was a really chilling experience and wonderful experience. I have never listened to the whole book, but I listened to that whole section that he read, and I was just blown away. So I'm glad you listened to it. I really think they did a wonderful job.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also, to your point, I think it's very challenging, especially if you try to do accents, to not fall into, you know, stereotypical cliche-ish kind of sounds. And I thought they were able to walk the fine line there and do a good job and make the characters real. So I thought the pacing, thought everything was really well done. So that's what I was curious.
Yeah, I'm really proud of it. And not enough, I wish more people knew about it. You know, my Hub City probably would not like me to start, you know, promoting my audiobook to the same degree, but I am really proud of it. And I know that it'll be there for a long time. And it's in a lot of libraries. The book and the audio are in libraries around the world, which I'm really happy about, in English.
Well, I found it on Libro, so I'm a big Libro person. So
yeah, good. Thanks for asking that.
And Kathryn, is your book only on hardback or is it also paperback?
It will be in paperback by the end of February. Finally sold enough hardbacks that they're putting it into paperback. And it was the Gardner Webb visiting writer that put me over to the magic number where they have a big advance in the hardback. Yeah. So I'm hoping that there will be more book clubs that are interested in it as a paperback. I know some of them have, you know, kind of don't ever look at hardbacks and they wait for the paperback. And in my case, I said, well, you might be waiting forever.
It's the longest one, 2 years. Yeah, 3 years almost.
Yeah, 3 years. But
it feels, I just want to say the feel, I love feeling books. Okay, I you know, ooh, feel good.
it is a beautiful book. I mean, Hub City books are really handsome and high quality. It is a beautiful book. And I, you know, wouldn't change a thing.
I'm off to Quail Ridge as soon as we end.
Okay. Thank you. You'll get one of the last hardbacks there are.
All right, friends. Are there any other questions for Kathryn Schwille?
You all have been great readers, a great audience. Thank you. I've enjoyed this so much.
Yeah, I don't take this group for granted.
Thank you.
No.
Wonderful.
No.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
So everybody stay healthy. Good writing to all of you who are writing.
And see you all February for David Menconi, who is another former reporter of a state newspaper. So the News and Observer, he retired a couple years ago, and David Menconi's book, Step It Up. And I just in Kannapolis, I stopped by the North Carolina Music Hall of Fame, which many of his subjects in the book are featured. So I was really excited to do that on Monday. I was coming from Tryon, and I saw Gardner Webb, and I thought of you, Kathryn, and then I thought of David. I was like, "Ooh, look at that!" And I was going to stop at the Earl Scruggs Museum, but it was closed Mondays.
Oh.
I play banjo, and that would have been cool.
Oh, I've got to get there when the pandemic's over. I got to get there.
We'll get there. All right. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for
Thank
your
you.
time.
Hey, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kathryn and
Well,
Alice.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Alice.
You're welcome. Bye.